Good morning, you're watching World News and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. European countries want lasting peace in Ukraine, not a ceasefire, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said after the emergency Paris summit on Monday. More on the meeting in the French capital in just a moment, but we start with the peace negotiations in Saudi Arabia, which are now underway. Senior American and Russian officials are holding talks on negotiating an end to the Russian war in Ukraine. This marks the most significant meeting between the two sides since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine nearly 3 years ago. The United States is represented in the Saudi Arabian capital by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Donald Trump's Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. They're discussing possible solutions to the war in Ukraine with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Vladimir Putin's Foreign Affairs Advisor Yury Ushakov, and the head of the Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, Kirill Dmitriev. According to Russian authorities, the meeting is purely bilateral and will not include Ukrainian officials. The talks mark another step by the Trump administration to reverse Joe Biden's policy of isolating Russia. They're also intended to pave the way for a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. On Monday night, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that defense spending will not be considered in the EU's excessive deficit procedure. Speaking following the Emergency Europe's leaders' meeting in Paris, Tusk added that all of the attendees had similar views on the issue and agreed on the importance of cooperation within NATO.
A very important confirmation, especially for us, that defence spending will no longer be treated as excessive spending. So we will not be threatened by the procedure of excessive deficit, which has its unpleasant consequences. And this is an important change. I won't say revolutionary, but in the history of the European Union, this is a very serious step forward in terms of the logic that Poland has been talking about for many months at various meetings in Europe.
The day after the summit in Paris, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk took to social media to emphasize his priorities on the issue of Ukraine, guided first and foremost by the security of Poland. In his post, he said, "Neither polling data nor suggestions from frenzied commentators will influence my decisions regarding Ukraine. Poland's security will remain the sole guiding principle here. This is what the efforts of our government and our diplomatic corps are aimed at. Efforts carried out in cooperation with our allies and Ukraine." Following the meeting in Paris, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer pointed to the role of the US in deterring the Russian war machine. At the same time, his Danish counterpart said Europe must scale up its army, echoing statements coming from the French President Emmanuel Macron and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
Europe must play its role, and I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
We seek a strong and lasting peace in Ukraine. To achieve this, Russia must end its aggression, and this must be accompanied by strong and credible security guarantees for the Ukrainians. Otherwise, there is a risk that this ceasefire will end up like the Minsk agreements. We are convinced that Europeans must invest better, more, and together in their security and defence, both for today and for the future.
I think the most important thing about this meeting tonight is the need for all of us to step up when it comes to our spendings on defense. Russia is not only a threat against Ukraine, but all of us. So we need to scale up and we need to speed up, and to do that we need also a discussion in the European Union about the fiscal rules.
Ready and willing. That's my take from today's meeting in Paris. Europe is ready and willing to step up, to lead in providing security guarantees for Ukraine. Ready and willing to invest a lot more in our security. The details will need to be decided, but the commitment is clear.
Wrapping up his trip in Brussels, Donald Trump's envoy for Ukraine, Kellogg, is meeting with the president of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen on Tuesday. Although the agenda for the meeting has not yet been released, much of it will likely revolve around Ukraine. Later in the day, Kellogg will be hosted in Warsaw by Polish President Andrzej Duda.
The Polish president will use the meeting to express his country's point of view on current geopolitics and the situation in Ukraine. Duda's office says that authorities in Warsaw are in close contact with their American counterparts, and the meeting is not extraordinary in nature. Nevertheless, it also marks the first time General Kellogg meets a foreign head of state face to face.
A group of Democratic and Republican U.S. senators has visited Kyiv to discuss security guarantees with Ukrainian lawmakers. Members of the American delegation say there is bipartisan support for offering Ukraine strong security guarantees, as well as involving Europe in the negotiations.
The bipartisan group in Congress that supports Ukraine and a positive resolution believe that we are not going to see any kind of negotiated end to this war unless there are security guarantees that people feel comfortable about. We saw what happened in 2014 when Russia came in, and we weren't tough enough. We saw the war start again in 22. We saw what happened in Georgia. And so I think those security guarantees could be done in a variety of ways. That's part of what this negotiation is going to be about. And I think the United States will have a role in that. I think Europe will have a role, but that's ultimately to be decided by any negotiation.
I believe, first, we should understand that this is just the beginning of a dialogue. There is no specific framework that's been mapped out yet, and we expect that will come to pass very quickly, we hope, and that Ukraine has to be front and center as a part of the negotiations to make sure that it's something sustainable.
A Russian drone attack was launched against Kyiv overnight. While the country's capital was shaken by several explosions, no casualties were reported.
The attacks targeted the northern parts of the city, but the incoming UAVs were engaged by Ukrainian air defense units. Debris from one Russian drone reportedly fell in a non-residential district of Kiev, sparking a fire at a warehouse and setting nearby cars ablaze.
It's too early to talk about sending Lithuanian troops as peacekeeping forces to Ukraine, as nothing is known about the ceasefire and eventual peace plan yet. This comes from Lithuanian Parliament Speaker Saulius Skvernelis.
I think today is too early to talk. There's nothing to talk about. We neither know the format of the negotiations nor the kind of peace that is to be sought, because we see statements that are very different, from essentially capitulation to seeking a formula for just peace. I think it's far too early to talk about this. When we truly see that Ukrainian interests are properly represented, and if there is such a need, then Lithuania will consider it. But now, there's no point talking about it.
Speaking on Monday in an interview with German broadcaster ARD, Volodymyr Zelensky said American officials being accommodating toward Vladimir Putin is a problem and warned of Europe's military preparedness for the war. The Ukrainian president then went on to say that although Europe increased military spending, it remains weak in terms of the size of their armies, navies, and air force.
The problem is that the US is saying things today that are very unpleasant for Putin. I think that's the core of it, because they want to please him. Do you know what for? To meet each other and have a quick win. But what they want, a just ceasefire. That's not success. I think Europe is weak today. Europe has become stronger in these 3 years. Production capacities have increased, technological strength has been improved, readiness has increased. But in terms of troop numbers and the size of fleets, air forces and drone units, I honestly think that Europe is weak today.
This is not the sort of meeting that is going to set the terms or make a decision, said Warsaw Security Forum's Joshua Bergen in conversation with TVP World when asked about the ongoing peace talks between Washington and Moscow. The negotiations are taking place on Tuesday in Saudi Arabia. Ukraine is not participating.
Well, there's an old expression in politics that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So, yes, I think Ukraine should legitimately feel some concern about not being represented. That being said, it was always understood, as I've read, it's been long understood, this is not a set of negotiations that brings Ukraine and Russia to the table together at this time. So to that end, I do believe this is not the sort of meeting that's going to set the terms, make a decision. I frankly think this is the beginning of what will be protracted talks, because I don't think this is going to land anytime soon. My personal view, perhaps it's wrapped up in the next couple months, but I think this is going to be multiple months, half a year, even 2 years. Won't surprise me if they're still negotiating.
Security is a common good, therefore it needs a common European answer, said Polish Finance Minister Andrzej Domański ahead of the Economic and Financial Affairs Council meeting in Brussels, which he's chairing. The bloc's finance and economy ministers are meeting to discuss the economic and financial impact of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. They will also debate the EU budget as well as recovery and resilience plans, among other pressing issues.
We definitely need to focus on the European solution. We need to, we believe that security is a common good, therefore we need a common European answer. This is why we will also try to convince our European partners to spend more on defense and also to create a strong European defense industry.
Meanwhile, the EU General Affairs Council has convened in Warsaw. The meeting is held as part of the Polish presidency in the Council of the EU.
During the gathering, the interior ministers of EU countries will discuss hybrid threats that the EU member states, as well as countries aspiring to join the bloc, are currently facing. Strengthening European military and civilian preparedness is also on the agenda, as are plans for the multi-annual financial framework for 2028 and beyond.
All 80 passengers and crew on board a plane that crash-landed before flipping over at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada survived the disaster.
All 80 passengers and crew on board a plane that crash-landed before flipping over at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada survived the disaster. Emergency services said 18 people were injured, 3 of them critically, when the aircraft overturned as it touched down in windy conditions on Monday afternoon local time. US carrier Delta said the flight from Minneapolis was operated by its Endeavour Air subsidiary. It had 76 passengers and 4 crew members on board. Airport officials said earlier on Monday that the facility was dealing with high winds and freezing temperatures as airlines attempted to catch up with missed flights after a weekend snowstorm. Canadian authorities have launched an investigation into the cause of the crash.
On Sunday night, temperatures in Poland's Tatra Mountains reached minus 41.1 degrees Celsius, breaking the previous lowest temperature record from 1929, which stood at minus 40.6 degrees. Responding to these extreme conditions, the Tatra Volunteer Search and Rescue Service issued an alert for altitudes above 1,800 meters. The extreme temperature was recorded in Lidworowy Kocioł, a glacial valley sitting at 1,800 meters above the sea level. The valley, known as a natural cold pan, traps heavy, chilled air between the peaks. The record low temperature was reported by researchers from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań as freezing weather swept across Poland in the past weeks. And with that truly bone-chilling piece of report, we're finishing our news broadcast for now, but please do stay tuned here on TVP World. Back in just a moment with more news and features.